Why do we, a country who has just seen a prime minister worth £700 million, previously saw a prime minister leave office and immediately make £10 million working for a financial company, why do we accept a situation which basically makes taxpaying voluntary for the people who own the country? For all of these people in the conversation, the vast majority of the economists, the politicians, the journalists, it is working for them. They get richer year after year, generation after generation. They have nice big houses with nice big gardens, and they are secure. So when they say, don't worry, we'll give you a little bit of economic growth, I want you to ask them for who? For who? I think you'd have to be terribly naive now to not see anything other than anti-immigrant political parties taking power all across the West within the next 5-10 years. They're not going to take action on inequality.
Gary Stevenson, hello, welcome back. Glad to have you back on PoliticsJOE.
Glad to be back.
You were obviously here last time round for the hardback of your book, The Trading Game. The paperback is here now. Delightful cover, delightful content. For people that might not have seen the last interview, for people who might not be familiar with your YouTube channel, tell us who you are and what you do.
So my name's Gary Stevenson. I run YouTube, Instagram, TikTok called Gary's Economics. It's explaining what's happening in our economic situation in the real world in an accessible way. My background is I studied maths and economics, and I was a trader for Citibank from 2008 until 2014. I made a lot of money by betting that the economy would never recover from 2008 crisis because of growing inequality. In 2011, I was Citibank's most profitable trader in the world. Quit that in 2014. I've basically spent the last 10 years trying to explain to people, if you don't deal with rapidly growing inequality of wealth, your living standards will get worse and worse and worse, and you'll see more and more and more poverty in your country, which I think is becoming increasingly obviously true. The channel's getting really popular. The book was a #1 last year.
Congratulations.
Yeah. People are interested because they can see that what's happening in the economy, basically. Yeah. And I'm just trying to make it really, really clear to people that's because of growing inequality. It's not separate to growing inequality. And yeah, the book is about telling that story. The YouTube is about telling that story. And I just want to get people aware that if we don't deal with this inequality, it gets worse. Yeah.
I guess we were just talking about it now before we started rolling. And in the time since we last spoke to you, there's been an election, well, two very important elections, particularly for British viewers. Obviously, the UK election, and then we saw Trump getting inaugurated this week. To stay with the UK just specifically for a second, I think a lot of people who care about wealth inequality and sort of saw a change of government and a new political party coming in after 14 years of a right-wing government were kind of expecting, maybe not immediately, the economic situation to improve, but certainly, a more, well, I won't say left wing, but we'll say a more socially progressive political party controlling government, and therefore hoping that something would be done to address wealth inequality and therefore an improving economic situation in this country, which isn't necessarily actually how it's gone since they got in. So I would just kind of, to start with, invite your opening remarks, I guess, about the new Labour government, about Rachel Reeves as Chancellor, and how you think, particularly with that budget, that's impacted the economic situation we find ourselves in now. Yeah,
so I don't just do a YouTube, right? Behind the scenes, I do try my best to talk to politicians, and you do get a sense of who's interested and who's not. We never, ever really had anyone show any sign of interest from the Conservative Party. So I was never surprised that they oversaw a massive increase in wealth inequality. But obviously, a lot of people might expect that Labour, being the left wing of the main political parties, would be more open to taking action on inequality, to shifting the taxation system more towards very rich people. But basically, because it's not just me who campaigns on these things, we saw very, very, very little appetite for them to do anything about that. Going into the election, the year before the election, 2 years before the election. When Keir Starmer first came in, before he did his reshuffle, there was a little bit of interest, but then there was a reshuffle just after he came in. Since then, I've never been contacted by any front bench MP, never, to this day. And the people I know who are more involved in lobbying, they just saw no interest. So for me, I put out videos before the election, just saying, listen, it was very clear Labour were going to win before, decently, a long time before the election, basically since the sort of Truss budget. Yeah. It was clear they were going to win. But it was clear to me that they weren't going to do anything. on inequality. And, I say that I still hope that one day they might have a change of heart, but it was clear to me that they weren't going to do anything on inequality. So if you're me, and if you have this belief that I have, that the reason the economy is getting worse is because inequality has got worse, you have the additional context that wealth inequality increased massively during COVID. When you see this incoming government that looks very unlikely to take any action on inequality, you have to accept that probably the economy is not going to improve. And of course, I'm sure if you had someone from Labour here, they'd say, it's only been 6 months, 9 months, give it time. I'm very, very pessimistic on their ability to significantly improve the economic situation. And that's what I've been saying for a long time. So, my concern is that people will lose faith in Labour. And, having lost faith in the Conservatives, if they then lose faith in Labour, and I think I said this last time I came on.
Yeah, you did.
If you see a loss of faith in both the traditional parties of the centre, then people are going to look for different options. And this is why you're seeing, massive growth in support for reform. But, if you look beyond the borders of the UK, exact same thing is happening in basically every country in Europe, the US. People are losing faith in these centrist political parties. And the obvious people who are up next is, anti-immigrant parties like Farage, like Trump.
Yeah. We'll come to that, I think. But there's two things. Well, there's a lot in your answer I want to get to. We'll come to Truss and the mini budget and the sort of the response of the bond markets, and particularly in the context of Reeves, in a second.
Yeah.
But let's say that Labour person was sat in this room with us now. Yeah, okay, we've had 6 months, we've had 9 months, we need more time. But crucially, I guess their argument would go, our whole pitch is we need to grow the economy, and if we grow the economy, that will then give us the bandwidth, the scope, the latitude to be able to then address the inequalities in our political and economic system, whether that's wealth inequality, whether that's social justice, whatever it is. That their pitch has essentially been, we have to grow the economy first before we can look to do any of the things that we sort of might have political motivations to do. I guess the question to you is, do you buy that argument?
My answer to that is, but how? But
You can't just keep saying
when was the last time a politician came into government with any economic policy other than our priority is to grow the economy? When was the last time? When? 50 years, that's all that's been said. We're going to grow the economy, we're going to grow the economy. So we've got, absolute consistent governance which insists our priority is growth. What is growth in this country? 1%. 1%. And I think that there's this, listen, I studied economics. I know people look at me and think this guy's not an economist, right? I've got 1 degree from London School of Economics and 1 from Oxford. Okay, I've studied this stuff. I know the theory, all right? You can't just keep saying growth. It's not like like a mantra. You just say it and you achieve nirvana.
Might as well
right?
be, at this point.
Listen, don't get me wrong, I'm not part of the anti-growth coalition. Economic growth is great. If you keep doing the same thing again and again and it consistently hasn't worked, why do you expect it to change now? And look, I hope it does work. And, you can see that they have changed economic policy a little, modestly. They want to spend a little bit more. They want to tax a little bit more. They want to borrow a little bit more. They want to invest a little bit more. And I don't think any of these things are necessarily bad ideas in and of themselves, but it's more of the same. It's more, what they did is what Biden did, but way less aggressive. And what happened to Biden? I just think what I see as somebody who's spent 5 years in elite university departments and has now spent 10 years floating around think tanks and politicians and journalists is a bunch of posh boys who keep thinking if they smash the numbers together and shout growth enough, it will happen. And it's just not working. I think we need to step back and ask ourselves, why is it continually failing to deliver? And we need to start thinking about what is it we're missing? Because nobody ever talks about distribution. What you had during COVID, do you know what the total government deficit now is since the beginning of COVID? Total amount of money given out by the government since the beginning of COVID.
And what total the debt pile is
total deficit, total increase in debt, so total deficit.
Like 700 billion quid, if not
it's
more.
now 1 trillion. £1 trillion. £1 trillion given out since the beginning of COVID. And now the government is in a situation, I'm sure we'll talk about this, where suddenly they're like, oh, actually, we can't afford to spend anymore. Well, who's got that £1 trillion you gave out? Who's got that now? There's this total lack of awareness of wealth and distribution of resources. You give out £1 trillion, and then suddenly you're like, oh, we don't have any money left. And there's not even the question of who has that £1 trillion. There's an absurd naivety, an absurd lack of focus on distribution and resources. And I know that this is kind of the status quo in university departments and probably in Whitehall, probably behind the scenes in the House of Commons. You need to open up your eyes and realise this is not working, understand why it's not working, and start looking at different ideas.
I'll keep playing, well, not necessarily devil's advocate because I don't think the arguments are very strong, but the counterpoint. Okay, so you go, right, yeah, I accept there's been this sort of gaping increase in wealth inequality. But Gary, what you're suggesting, i.e., redistributive taxation, i.e., to address these inequalities, it won't work. We'll get capital flight, and the problem with the underlying weakness, I guess, in our economy is anemic gains in productivity growth. And if we take that approach, you won't see an increase in productivity, and what little capital we do have remaining in the country, it's going to fly elsewhere. So we can't pursue that sort of policy program.
The first thing I would say is I'm not advocating for redistributive taxation. I'm advocating to stop the redistributive taxation. What is happening now is a massive, massive increase in wealth inequality. Ordinary families are no longer being able to own their own home. They're massively in debt. The government's lost its assets. It's massively in debt. So a massive loss in wealth holding by ordinary families and by the government. Where's that wealth gone? It's held by the super rich. The redistribution has happened. It is happening. I'm trying to stop the redistribution. I am campaigning against redistribution because the redistribution is happening as we speak, okay? The second part of the argument, if you tax them, they'll leave. I think this depends on a lack of understanding of what I mean and what wealth is, basically. Because obviously an ordinary person, for them what matters is their job, and their main source of money is their job. And they work and they make money, that's how they get an income. If you're Rishi Sunak and your net wealth is £700 million, your wealth doesn't come from your job. Your income doesn't come from your job. Your income comes from your assets. So if I were to tax you, if I were to turn around, Ollie, we're going to massively raise your tax, you could probably shoot this from Dubai. You could probably do that. You could release it here and it would be fine. But if what you own is £700 million of British assets, you go to Dubai, well, where's your money come from? If you're owning British houses, British property, British businesses, British government debt, British mortgages, well, your money is coming from British people when they pay their mortgage, when they pay their rent, right? So these guys who own, I'm not talking about tax. I've never once said I want to raise tax on working people. I want to raise tax on the hoarders of wealth, okay? And if these guys leave, they live in the Cayman Islands now. Let me ask you a question. If I bought £1 billion of Chinese assets, and when they turn around to me at the end of the year and say, where's your tax, Gary? I say, oh, sorry, I live in the Cayman Islands. Do you think they'd accept that?
No.
No, they don't. So why do we accept it?
Yeah.
Why do we, a country who has just seen a prime minister worth £700 million, whose father-in-law is one of the richest people in the world, previously saw a prime minister leave office and immediately make £10 million working for a financial company, why do we accept a situation which basically makes taxpaying voluntary for the people who own the fucking country?
Yeah.
I'm not talking about, I've never once said tax working people. These guys own your house. These guys own your mortgage. These guys own the government debt. These guys own the hospitals that you need to go to when you're sick. These guys own the land that makes the food, right? The question is, do you want your country, the assets, the physical wealth of your country, to be owned by people who pay tax in your country? And if your answer is no, then what you will get is bankruptcy. And that is what you're seeing. It's absurd. It's absurd. China doesn't allow it. Why the hell do we allow it?
Yeah, I think the you're driving to a deeper question, right? Which is like what is the purpose of our political system? What is the purpose of the economy? Right? Is it to provide a decent standard of living to the people that inhabit the country? And yeah, okay, it's nice if we have economic growth, or it's nice if that we don't have a deficit, obviously, but the sort of the counter arguments that you often get will be like, well, what happens to productivity, or what happens to growth? And it's like, yeah, those numbers, they are important, they are indicators of the health of an economy. But at the end of the day, if the majority of the population are slipping closer and closer towards a state of poverty, the typical economic indicators and things that we're told to care about become less relevant, because it's this deeper question of like, for whom does the economy function?
Yeah, I always remember this one moment in the Brexit debates. I can't remember. I don't think it was George Osborne. It might have been George Osborne. A Conservative politician was on Question Time, and he said, if we leave the EU, GDP will drop by 6.7%. And some woman stood up in the audience, that's your GDP. Yeah. And she got kind of mocked, but I love it because it's true, right? Yeah. Look, what is GDP now compared to 50 years ago? What is GDP now compared to 50? It's massively, massively, massively higher. But my dad didn't go to university, worked in a post office for 40 years, never once earned even probably median wage in this country, was able to buy a house, support a family, he's retired now. He's never been rich, but he's got a comfortable retirement. He owns the property that he lives in. And now you've got families with 2 parents with advanced degrees can't afford to own property. So listen, listen, economic growth is great. It's fantastic. Increasing your productivity is great. It's fantastic. What does it matter if people can't afford financial security and homes? And I think an important message that I want to send to people watching this is, from me, somebody who comes from a poor background, has been to elite universities, has been involved in the discussion about economics in the media, in politics. The people who are having these discussions are almost all of them from relatively rich families and financially comfortable. And for them, it's fine. For them, it's fine. And for them, it works. So when they say economic growth, productivity, I want you to remember, for all of these people in the conversation, the vast majority of the economists, the politicians, the journalists, it is working for them. They get richer year after year, generation after generation. They have nice big houses with nice big gardens, and they are secure. So when they say, don't worry, we'll give you a little bit of economic growth, I want you to ask them for who? For who? Because what I see, coming from a poor background, is there's nobody like me in that conversation. I'm from East London, right? But it's not just me. I don't hear any Manchester accents. I don't hear any Birmingham accents. I don't hear any Belfast accents. You know what I mean? If you're lucky, you might find a really posh Scottish guy in there once every 10 years. You know what I mean? The ordinary people are not being represented. And I always remember there was one time, remember when Russell Brand wanted to get into politics?
Yeah.
And he went on Newsnight.
Yep.
And he spoke to Evan Davis, PPE Oxford, okay? And he was saying living standards are falling. He was talking at the time about these E15 mums in Stratford getting forced out of the places where they grew up. And he was saying living standards are falling. And Evan Davis, Oxford PPE, same degree as Boris, same degree as David Cameron, I think. Turned around, the rest of them, turned around and showed him a 150-year graph of GDP per capita, and said, "No, look, it's fine, because it's fine for him. It's fine for him." I was at 2017, 2019. I was at Oxford, and the course was just 2 years of inverting fucking matrices. Right, that's all it was: maths, algebra. In the mid-year review, they said, "What do you think of the course?" I said, "I think it's shit." And they said, "You know, what's wrong with it? You're not talking about the housing crisis. You're not talking about why people can't get jobs." And these guys, we're sitting in a castle wearing capes, by the way. That's what we have to wear, bow ties. They turn around to each other, and they couldn't believe it. And the guy in the middle said to me, "What do you mean? The economy is getting better?" Because for them, it is getting better. For them, it is getting better. So don't allow these guys to throw their graphs and to throw their numbers at you while they get richer every year and while you can't afford to turn your fucking heating on. You know, that's the whole reason. My channel is about educating the public, but also making them feel like they are allowed, like they have a right to have an opinion about the economy. And if you can't afford to buy a house, and if you can't afford to have a family, and if in increasingly common extreme cases, you're struggling to feed your kids, you have a right to say, "I don't care about your economic growth. We need food and housing and education." You know, when did we get that? When was the last time we saw a massive increase in living standards?
Just after the Second World War.
After the Second World War, when people had been forced to kill each other for 6 years. And during that time that we devoted our whole economy to killing each other, back home, the government made sure that people had food and housing and healthcare and education. We made sure that people had food and housing and healthcare and education. And these guys realised if we can devote our entire economy to killing each other and still provide our people with food and housing and healthcare and education, then we can do it when there's no war. And we can still do it now. We can still do it now. And I want to empower people to demand that, because we can do it.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I guess it's for different drivers and different reasons, but in a quite similar way, you find yourself in a position where these basic elements of the social contract have essentially been broken, right? Where it's like that time you're referring to, where it's like you could have a job that's possibly even below the median wage, and yet you could still put a roof over your family's head. You could possibly support a family with one wage and one income rather than two. You know, you could own a home, and we're moving away from that. And instead of sort of going, right, we've had this horrific war, well, what do we actually want? And there's the post-war consensus, and we talk about, you know, a massive increase in social housing and education, and all the other sort of things that ran alongside it. And instead, it seems, to the point you touched on earlier, we have this political shift instead towards the radical right and the new right, and this well, I guess tale as old as time, maybe, economic hardship, what happens politically, where you get scapegoating of minorities, be they immigrants, be they sort of people from different gender identities, whatever it is. And it seems like the sort of the left, the centre, whether that's Joe Biden, whether it's Keir Starmer, and the fixation on kind of these economic metrics that we've been talking about, of basically like delivery. Biden says, well, we've had a record number of jobs, I think that's more than 1 million jobs or something to the American economy, and we've got growth that the other G7 nations could only dream to have. And your man in Arkansas just turns around and says, I pay more than $10 for a box of eggs. I don't give a fuck about what GDP growth is.
Yeah.
It feels like the sort of the political parties that would typically respond to those arguments with something like a post-war consensus they've almost been like castrated. They don't have the answers to the moment that we find ourselves in, and it's the radical right that actually goes, you know what, it's an immigrant, it's a trans person, or whatever, and you're sort of crying out, thinking, yeah, but a trans person probably isn't their landlord. A trans person probably doesn't, isn't domiciling their assets in a tax haven.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm very frustrated with the mainstream parties of the centre left, and I've been frustrated with them for a long time. Look, I didn't start my YouTube channel until 2020, right? And I quit my job as a trader in 2014. And I know now, I've got a book with my fucking face on the cover and a YouTube with my face and my name on the cover. But I know it's all like, it's the Gary Stevenson show. I didn't want to do that. I didn't, you've read the book, right? So I spent like fucking a year and a half getting fucking harassed by one of the biggest corporations in the world. I nearly got sued into bankruptcy, right? I didn't want to come out and be like, oh, let's start the Gary Stevenson show. I wanted to go to the fucking Philippines and drink pina coladas, right? And I wanted to work on this, let's reduce wealth inequality, but I didn't want to be the guy at the front. I looked around for fucking ages for people doing this work, for people working on wealth inequality, and I couldn't find them. I looked in the political parties, I looked in the think tanks, I looked in academia. And the reason behind it is basically because all of that work needs funding. And rich people who are very happy to fund the work on climate change, identity issues, minority issues, which are all important issues, they tend not to want to fund the work that says tax rich people more, right? So there's a question of why the mainstream political parties aren't doing it. I think that comes down to, really, first of all, we shouldn't tar everyone with the same brush, right? Look, there were good people in Labour. I'm sure there's some good people in the Conservative Party. Please email me if you're one of them, because I'd love to meet you. There's good people in there, but at the end of the day, their economic policies are dominated by these economic PhD types. And I want you to realise, right? Imagine you're me, right? You come from East London, you come from a poor family, you've got a very good degree from LSE. You're 20 years old. You're choosing what to do for a job. You could, I'm going to go work for government. I'm going to become an academic. I'm going to stop inequality. You'll have to do a master's, PhD, postdoc. You'll be spending money, borrowing money every year. You'll probably be 200 grand in debt by the time you're 30. You might be making 70, 80 grand a year in your late 30s. Or you go into finance. And I was a multimillionaire at 25. So what kind of people go into that world? And if you actually look, economics, PhD, is the least social class representative PhD in the whole country. And it's obvious why, because if you're poor and you've got a very good economics degree, you'd be kind of mad to do a PhD because you can make so much more money in the city, right? And then the end result is, it drives me mad. I did this 2-year master's at Oxford. It's like 100 posh people in a building talking about how's the economy working, while inequality is going like that, which means that their lives are becoming unbelievably richer. Poor people are struggling to eat, and they're just saying everything's fine. I think we have a massive problem of class diversity and class representation in economics, but also in journalism. I'm sure you will be aware of that, and in politics. And this is why, before I did my YouTube, I was writing articles. I wrote articles for The Guardian. And, that was when I used to get contacted by like some Labour MPs. And I actually got quite popular on this sort of like economics left with my early COVID stuff. And this was during COVID. And then my mates would come to me like, Gary, this stuff you're saying, I'm fucking worried. I'm worried about, will I be able to have a house? Will I be able to have a family? And that's when I realised, like, while I'm writing articles in The Guardian, nobody's talking to the public. Who is talking to your average guy on the street? Well, I'll tell you who's talking about this, about the economy. It's Nigel Farage, and it's Donald Trump, and it's Andrew Tate. These guys talking to the man on the street. So I shifted to YouTube because, unfortunately, I honestly believe politics and most of the media and academic economics is so unbelievably middle class. And because the thing you need to understand is when the crisis is a crisis of inequality, it's good for the middle class. And for our American viewers, in this country, the middle class basically means the top 10%, right? Those guys, it's working for them. It's working for them. It's working for them. And the reason I switched to YouTube is because I honestly believe we will never be given progress by these guys who benefit from our impoverishment. They will, and they don't even realize it. They don't even, I don't know if you remember, there was this whole period, and it's still happening now, by the way. There was this whole period of the vibes are off. Did you hear this term, the vibes are off? It was an American term, which was basically, why is everybody so unhappy when the economy is so good?
Yeah.
There was an article in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago by a smart journalist. The guy who does their diagrams is John Murdoch.
John Murdoch.
Yeah, smart guy.
Yeah.
And it included the line, probably slightly paraphrasing here, the situation for the poorest is unambiguously good. All right. Now, I don't know this guy, John Bember. I don't want to, I'm sorry to him if he's watching, because it's not an attack on him, because this is the kind of thing I see throughout economics. All right. I suspect this guy is not in the poorest, and I suspect no one in his family is, and I suspect not many of his friends are. Let's bring in the poorest person, someone in the poorest 10%, and ask them, do you think the situation for you in the last 10 years has been unambiguously good? These guys can't afford to turn the fucking heating on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's I think we, and increasingly I see myself, look, I would be open to working with Labour. I'd be open to working with the Conservatives. I'd be open to working with Reform. I want to build power amongst the ordinary working people of this country, because I don't trust these guys who are almost always in the top 10% to deliver for us.
I wasn't expecting you to hear you say that you'd work with Reform as well, to be honest with you.
Mate, listen, this is not a fucking joke what's going to happen here.
Your point is basically it doesn't matter about their politics. If they want to take wealth inequality seriously, you'll work with them.
I've been betting on this for 14 years now, right? It was 2011 I started betting on the economy getting worse and worse and worse, right? That's when I realised this was going to happen. And I've been betting on it year after year, and I make money year after year, and I see it happen year after year. And it's not a fucking joke, right? This means people can't afford to have families. This means parents skip fucking meals so that the kids can eat. That's happening. Yeah. And this is not just the bottom 10% anymore. This is 30%, 40%, 50%. And don't fool yourself into thinking this cannot get worse. Go to India. Go to Brazil. Go to Nigeria. Go to Vietnam. Look what life is like for the average person. The average person, the person in the middle. To be honest, increasingly, I think that life in Vietnam might be better at the middle for your normal person, right? And don't tell yourself, don't use this classic Trump line where they're shithole countries, Read Charles Dickens. You know what I mean? What was life like here 100 years ago for your average person?
It's because you read that sort of writing around London, like Industrial Revolution London, and people like Dickens and people like others are like, this is disgusting. Like, this is bad. There's pollution in the streets, pollution in the water. Like children are dying, and society changes. Like they do sort of go, do you know what, actually we've got this wrong. We need to course correct. And I suppose maybe that could give you cause that there can be optimism about this. That just because the economy is structured in the way that it is currently does not mean it could be different. Does not mean that something else could take its place. Whether that's in relation to any issue in our economy, whether it's like big tech, fossil fuels. Like you take your pick. Alternatives are possible, right? Yeah,
things can change. Things can change. I mean, the speed with which living standards increased after the Second World War compared to what they were like 50, 60 years before was unbelievable. I talk about what my dad's life was like, and he was earning less than average salary. By no means did he ever live a life of luxury, but Dickens is not long before that, making my dad sound fucking old. But it wasn't. Dickens talking in the late 19th century. You know what I mean? We're talking about 70 years before. The speed of that change of what life was like at the middle, or even in the bottom half, that speed was unbelievably quick. So it can be done, but the flip of that is things can get worse as well.
Yeah.
And the last 70, 80 years we've had here in the UK, in the US, in most of Europe, in most of the West, that is not the historical norm. That is the abnormality, right? And I would argue that is because we fought for a fairer share and we fought for a fairer taxation system, and how easily that can be lost. You know, we've lost that taxation system now. We lost it in the 80s. And really, since then, all you've seen is increases in inequality and significant decreases, I would argue, in living standards for ordinary people. So, yes, 100% there is hope. And I think, you know, look, and obviously, you know, nobody alive now was around then. The speed of those increases in living standards, because you reduced inequality, unbelievably rapid increase in living standards. But you have to be realistic. Look at the political situation now. We will 100% get change. I guarantee you that. If we speak again in 5 years, 10 years, the political situation, the economic situation will be dramatically different. And the reason for that is, it is not politically sustainable to consistently drive down the living standards for the majority of people. People don't want that, right? People don't want their kids to be poorer than they are. People don't want their grandkids to live in poverty. So politicians have to offer something new, and eventually they have to deliver something new. But if you look around now, we'll get it. I mean, you're seeing it now. You're seeing it now, you know. If you look around now, people hate the Conservatives, they hate Labour. And I could have said the same about the main political parties in France, in Germany, in America, in basically every country. People hate the old political parties because they know the status quo is failing. They want something new. But in every country, including this country, who is first in line to be that new thing? And I think you'd have to be terribly naive now to not see anything other than anti-immigrant political parties taking power all across the West within the next 5-10 years. I think that's inevitably going to happen. They're not going to take action on inequality. They're not. So if I'm right that inequality is the cause, if you look at their policies, you know, Trump comes in, slashes tax on the rich straight away. Well, that's going to make inequality worse. They're not going to take action on inequality, and all that means is things are going to get worse. And then, you know,
compounds on itself.
Well, I'll make my predictions for you now. You know, this is, you know, come back, bring me on in 10 years.
You've got a track record of betting successfully as well.
These guys will get into power. They won't take action on inequality, which means they'll fail on the economy. Living standards will continue to fall. And what would they do? What would they say? They will say, this is because the centre, the more centrist factions of our party, they might be the more centrist in reform, it might be the Conservatives, stopped us from being as serious on immigration as we needed to be. So after they reduce immigration to zero and that doesn't work, what comes next? You got to start kicking people out. You know, and I watched, you know, the interviews of people being interviewed in Washington DC. A lot of people saying deport them. You know, that's where we're going, right? That is where, and you know, I said it last year and I said it 2 years ago. That's what happens when the centre fails. That is what happens when the centre fails. You know, I think it was Milton Friedman said, at times of crisis, your new solution will be chosen from the ideas lying around at the time. And it is extremely obvious what the loudest idea lying around is at the moment. And what I am trying to do, I'm working my tits off to build another idea, which is the reason you're getting poorer is because of aggressive increases in wealth inequality. It's because your wealth is going to the rich. The rich are getting richer. They are outcompeting you for the basic resources you need. And unless you stop that, you will keep getting poorer. And I would love for people to get behind that, you know. If you don't want to see in the next 10 years people being deported from this country, you know, and history tells us this doesn't even need to be recent migrants, you know. Read your history books and see what happened in not just Germany in the 20th century, but a lot of places in the 20th century, you know. My grandparents were deported from the country they were in. You know, this is... If you don't want that, you need to get behind building an alternative message. And for me, honestly, I think this message that the problem is the super rich, the problem is growing inequality, is the only message that can compete with the problem is foreigners, the problem is migrants. And history shows us where that can end up.
Yeah. I said I'd ask you about Liz Truss, and we kind of went in a different direction, but obviously she was out there at the inauguration. And actually the way to probably talk about her is in contrast to the Reeves budget, because at the start of this year, we also saw an increase in government borrowing costs. You know, I think the sort of just servicing the debt now is something like 100 billion. You know, it's lumpy. 100% of debt is 100% of GDP. And I guess I would invite your comments about the difference between the Reeves and the Truss budget, that both saw this kind of, admittedly at differing speeds, increase in government borrowing costs, and why perhaps the Reeves budget didn't lead to the same kind of sense of like chaos and collapse that happened as a result of the Truss budget, and the differences between them.
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty clear from things I've put out and things I've said. I'm not Reeves's biggest fan, but I think the comparisons with Truss are unlucky. I think the correct term is unlucky, because what Truss did and the way that she did it was quite, well, it was wild and deeply irresponsible. And what the results in financial markets were extremely chaotic as a response of a bad strategy and a badly implemented strategy, badly prepared strategy by her. Say what you like about Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. Wild and chaotic are probably not terms that you could fairly accuse them of. You could say that they made some mistakes in their budget. You know, I think forcing themselves to raise specifically employers' national insurance was probably a bad idea. Maybe they felt they had to do it to win the election. The budget was pretty mild. It was pretty mild, you know. They came in, they increased spending a bit, they increased taxation a bit, they increased borrowing a bit. It was a mild budget. And on the day of the budget itself, markets, they responded in a pretty mild way, basically, because it was a mild budget. They then had the bad luck of an increase in global interest rates. The problem you have in the UK is the UK has a kind of uniquely specific set of bad things happening, which is inflation is higher than in Europe, for example, which means that interest rates are high. So interest rates are significantly higher here than they are in Europe. Growth is low. Growth is only 1%. So debt, as you say, is high. So if you have a situation where when they did the budget, the rates are about 4%, and you've got growth of 1%, and you've got inflation of 2.5%. I think you need to understand a little bit the maths here, right? Which is inflation chips away at your debt. And that is why governments can get away with increasing their debt every year, because inflation is fighting against it, GDP growth is fighting against it. Because you get 2.5% inflation, even at 1% growth, you can afford to pay 3.5% interest and your debt is stable. But once those interest rates get up to sort of 4.5%, putting up to 5%, it starts to look unstable and the government situation starts to look shaky. So the government, they were unlucky, but also they weren't unlucky in the sense that I speak about this again and again, I talk about it a lot on the channel. We knew at the very beginning of COVID that the way we were going to deal with COVID would significantly deteriorate government finances. And we should have known that it would also significantly increase the wealth of the richest, which had a significant risk of causing an inflation crisis. And you can go and look, I put a video out in 2020, I think it was June 2020, my first video, where I said, this is going to cause a collapse in government finances, which could well cause austerity. It will cause a massive increase in the wealth of the richest, which will probably cause an inflation crisis. It's exactly what I did. These things were not unpredictable. In fact, I predicted them, right? So we knew for the whole of COVID that we were going to massively increase inequality and massively deteriorate the government financial situation. Once you do that, these kind of situations that the government has got themselves into now were always a risk. And we had a period, 2.5 years, where the economy was basically closed, where we could have had that discussion of, okay, either we try and claw some of that money back, which means we try and figure out how do we tax the country's richest people, or we accept that there is a very real possibility that we will have to close down parts of the welfare state. Because that is what happens when you become poorer. You have to sell things. You lose the ability to afford things. So comparisons with Truss are unlucky. Look, Rachel Reeves is not Liz Truss. I think that is clear. Rachel Reeves is... I think there is perhaps a lack of ambition, not specifically from Reeves. I've never met Reeves. She could be a lovely person. But from the economic establishment in general, a lack of ambition. What she did was incomparable to Truss in terms of madness, basically. And I don't think Rachel Reeves, while she could be accused of being unambitious and not sort of seeing the big picture, she's not wild and crazy. But the truth is, we are in a situation now, unarguably, where government financial plans are at the whims of the financial traders. And what I want to make clear is, if your plan is to give all of your wealth away as a government and then borrow it back to pay for the things that you need, which has been, that's a combination of the Conservatives and Labour, like that is what we've done as a country. If your plan is to give your wealth away and borrow it back, you will always be at the whims, at the behest of the financial markets. You'll be at the behest of the lenders, you'll be at the whims of the rich, because your plan is to borrow it back. And that is what happened. This is what happens, not just to the UK, but to any country, which gives all of its wealth to the rich and takes taxing the rich off of the table of policy options. That's obvious. If I give you all of the wealth, and my plan is, well, whatever we do, we can't take any money from Ollie, well, no one else is going to get very fucking much. And the problem is, this only gets worse, because the wealth of the rich will compound. They will get richer, they will get richer, they will get richer. If we do not find ways to tax them, if we do not fix that problem of these guys are untaxable, then we will lose everything over time.
Yeah. I want to come, we'll sort of talk specifically about what those measures might look like in a second. But in that period from June 2020, when you put that video out, to now, tons has happened, right? Your platform has grown exponentially, book deal, hardback, paperback, etc. And obviously you get a bigger platform, more attention, and also more scrutiny. I think specifically as well, the FT has kind of challenged some of the claims that you made in that book. I mean, primarily about the claim that you were the most profitable trader at Citibank. How do you, first of all, how do you answer those criticisms? But secondly, how do you interpret that increase in scrutiny? Do you view it as sort of fair media challenge to sort of your public statements? Do you view it as because the ideas that you're espousing present a challenge to some of these established interests?
I think the reason, obviously you'd have to ask the guys at the Financial Times. The reason that basically the same article got put out in the Daily Mail months before, and the same article got put out in the Financial Careers. And I know basically why it's happened. It's one guy I used to work with has basically sort of really, really got to be in his bonnet about this thing, unfortunately. I'll be very clear. I was Citibank's most profitable trader in 2011. This was always my claim. I've been very specific. I've written a book about it. Very, very, that is true. That is a true claim. But obviously, you say that, and then you give interviews, and they run a headline, Gary Stevenson, best trader in the world of all time, which is what the media do. And if you read the book, you'll see there was another guy at Citibank who was fucking legendary trader, best trader in Citibank every single year, 2008, 2009, 2010, not 2011, because it was me, 2012, 2013. And this guy is obviously, he's a legendary trader, right? So I think it's kind of, this guy, I think what happened was, I tried to speak to this guy before the book came. I felt that he was quite emotionally exposed in the book, so I tried to sort of prep him.
And you do you obscure the identity of a lot of the
characters. Yeah.
But
But this funny thing happened, right? So when I wrote the pitch, I used all the real names. And I sent it to my agent. And then my agent said, before we send it out, you've got to change all the names. And it hadn't, my background is not writing, right? So it hadn't even occurred to me, you've got to change the names, right? So what I did was, I texted all of the guys in the book, right? I texted them.
What do you want your pseudonym to be?
Yeah, I said, I'm writing this name, I'm writing this book, and you're in it, and I've got to change your name. And they all sent back the most ridiculous comedy names, that I just couldn't use. So I couldn't use any of their names. But they knew the book was coming out. But I think what it was, and obviously you have to ask him really. Obviously, if your mate texts you writing a book, you just think this is fucking going to go nowhere, basically. And then there was this massive press campaign, right? And I think this guy just maybe started just kind of shit himself a bit, basically. And I tried to speak to him about it, but he was blowing up. He was like, you weren't the best trader. And I was like, listen, it's a very specific claim. This is the best trader 2011, which I was. He's like, you weren't the best trader. So it's kind of...
It was like 35 mil, wasn't it, P&L?
Yeah, 2011. And the FT article is like, well, this other guy made $1 billion in 2008. And you're like, well, that's not 2011. It's ridiculous sort of... I've been very clear about, I've never claimed to be George Soros. I'm not a billionaire,
One day, Gary.
In 2011, I was Citibank's top trader. I got paid a lot of money,
So do you think it's ego of that guy? Do you think there's something more? Because at the end of the day, right, if we look at the media environment in the UK, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, if you disagree with this, it's absolutely fine, you can tell me so. But there's a lot of billionaire owners of the media in the UK. There's clearly, some political interest for the reason that people buy media organisations. I'm not making this accusation specifically about the Financial Times, to be clear. That media buys you influence, and therefore, if someone comes along, starts putting a bit of a profile, being like, the root cause of the problem in our economy is wealth inequality. That clearly poses a challenge to the interests of a lot of these media owners.
Yeah.
Do you view it as that, or do you think it is just sort of this
You know
one guy?
what? My honest opinion is probably not. My honest opinion is probably not. I think that the weirdest thing happened before the article came out. Everybody messaged me. There's only 2 guys named in the article who've used their names. They both messaged me. The journalist messaged me, and they all basically said the same thing, which was, please talk about this article on your YouTube channel and mention me by name. And it was just crazy. These guys all basically came in and said the same thing, and it was just sort of like, and I think that kind of makes you kind of realize what happened, which is like my profile blew up and I became kind of like this buzzy thing for a bit. And then you're a journalist at the Financial Times, someone comes in and you're just thinking, maybe I can get a lot of fucking clicks off of this guy's face. And then,
It's the way it works.
Yeah, and you work in media, you know what I mean? And
there's a reason we want to speak to you, right? Like people want to hear what you have to say. You bring people's eyeballs.
And the FT contacted me beforehand, but obviously, like, I just send everything. Anyone who contacts me gets sent to Penguin. I get like 100 emails a day, right? It goes to Penguin. And Penguin basically say no comment. And it is very frustrating. It's very frustrating to be accused of being a liar when you haven't lied, and to be forced to just say like no comment on it. But I think they were right. Because the thing is, I don't know, you will have probably witnessed this, right? You have a public profile, right? There will have been a first time somebody online accuses you of something that is like wildly untrue. And your first instinct is to be like, that's untrue.
Yeah.
But as soon as you bite on it, you've lost.
Yeah.
As soon as you bite on it, you've lost. So I think this is because then everybody comes in, and because the thing is, you are the story. You are the story. And there's all of this, there's so many, there's this really consistent, like, popular theory on me, which is that I'm always on cocaine. And you see every video, there's guys beneath it that are like, oh my God, this guy's off his tits. There'll be people.
To finish the interview. I need to do a line.
There will be people under this. You'll look, if you've seen the comments of this, they'll be like, look at this guy, he's off his tits on cocaine. Every single time, man. People won't believe this. I've never taken cocaine in my life. I was expelled from school at 16 for smoking weed, and I was like, this is it. We're not doing it anymore. But there's nothing you can do, and I think this is...
I've had that one. I've been accused of doing gear. I have like a bit of a nervous tick. I was at the Cambridge Union, and I was like I kept sort of grabbing my nose like this, and they were like, look at him, he's on the gear.
Oh, but there was, because of my interview with you guys last year, I came in and I swore my tits off.
Yeah, you did.
Because the thing, what people don't realise is, I was on a media blackout for a year. Oh. They put me on a media blackout for a year because they're like, they're like, what we want is for like you to be everywhere when the book comes out. So I've written this book, and I thought the book was really good, and I was like, I think this book's going to blow up. And you're seeing these fucking terrible political and economic decisions like destroying the country, and you can't say anything. And this was the first interview I did, and I was so like, it was like it all came out.
Let's go.
Yeah. So then I think, to be fair, actually, having looked back at the interview I did with you guys last year, I can see why people think I'm constantly on cocaine. But I think it's just. This is my life now. This is my life now. People will say shit about me. Some guy will come up, Gary slapped me with a fish, and it will be on the front page of the Daily Mail. Yeah. Gary slaps a guy with a fish, and that's my life now. That's what it is. Isn't it?
And making that adjustment, right? It's kind of peculiar, right? Because at the end of the day, the thing we're talking, I know it affects everyday people, but at the end of the day, we are still talking about like economics, and you wouldn't necessarily say that's the thing that like grabs the public's imagination to a particularly high level, and yet there is this huge, we find it with our interviews, whether we interview you, whether we've interviewed other economists, like people want to understand the way the economy operates and why they feel like the way they do. And crucially, I think this like disassociative effect of when Evan Davis puts up the graph that shows you that GDP per capita growth has grown exponentially, or they hear someone like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris basically being like, the last 4 years have been good. And they're sort of going, no, they have not for me. And that disconnect between not just media commentary, but political commentary and their day-to-day experience. And you can pick any political issue. I don't want to talk about any of the wars that we have going on right now. But again, they can see things on social media that are like horrify their basic humanity. And then the way that a politician talks about it, or the way that it's represented in the media, go, that does not represent what I've seen today on my Twitter feed, or whatever it is. And I think that gap between like reality, everyday experience versus the depiction and representation of a thing, as that widens, that is the sort of the space in which the political extremism that you're referencing, that's where it comes into the picture and that's where it starts to flourish.
Yeah, but it's also why my YouTube is so popular, in a way. And I think it's... one thing you recognise when you're a trader is traders don't watch the news. Right? Traders don't watch the news. Right? They have their own sources of news. And you realise that most of the things which are reported in the news, they don't affect the markets, which means probably they don't have a significant effect on the economy. And yet really big things happen that affect the economy, which is never in the news, basically. And then but then that makes sense, right? Because the traders get paid £1 million a year, and the economist doing research for your news show gets paid probably 30 grand a year. So the fact is, unfortunately, the economic product on the news is kind of shit, and it will be because you can't afford it. You can't afford me. You couldn't afford to pay me what it would cost you to pay me to do this show. Yeah, you couldn't, because a bank will pay me 50 grand a day. You know what I mean? Yeah. To sit on a trading floor. So you can't afford that product. But that in itself is a product of wealth inequality. Mm. Because if you have this group of super rich people that can pay me 50 grand a day to sit in a skyscraper behind 12 screens, well, of course you're not going to get the best economic analysis, because you can't compete with those guys.
That's it, isn't it? It's like on the trading floor, there's a guy plugged into a Bloomberg terminal. He's got all his screens, and maybe up on the pillar, BBC News might be running in the background on mute. And every so often, the desk, when a prime minister resigns, they might unmute it to hear the speech and be like, "Oh, that was interesting."
They'll turn it on if there's a football game.
Yeah, do you know what I mean?
And that's the way that works.
Okay, so let's say then, Gary, rather than me being sat here with you now, it's Rachel Reeves. The Labour Party has had the luxury of not having to pay you 50 grand a day.
Yeah,
they get your unfiltered insights, they get your unfiltered analysis, and Rachel Reeves says to you, Gary, how do I stimulate the economy? How do I address wealth inequality? How do I make life better in this country for millions of people? What measures are you if you get that time with her, what ideas are you putting in her head?
Well, I think if you're being realistic, you have to accept that this is going to be fucking difficult for a variety of reasons. It's not practically easy to tax these guys, right? In some ways it is, because they own the assets, right? And the assets are fixed, and you want to tax the assets, right? But the real big difficulty about it is they're unbelievably powerful in terms of political power and media power. And they will push all of that against you. They will push everything they can against you. And I think... But the second thing is, it is actually difficult to do. You need to be... People are worried when they see my videos and I say tax the rich. Even if I'm really explicitly clear, I'm not talking about taxing wages. I'm not talking about taxing work income. I'm talking about taxing hoarded assets, accumulated wealth of above 10 million or above 5 million, which excludes the vast majority of what people will ever achieve. They're worried that I'm going to say do that. The government will come in with some tax that's supposed to tax the rich. The rich will avoid it, and it will end up hitting people in the middle. They're worried about that. And I am 100% worried about that as well. I'm not naive to think that's not a risk. That is 100% a risk. And I always remember when the Conservatives brought in their extra tax on the extra stamp duty on second homes. 3% extra stamp duty on buying a second home. And there was an exemption in there for anyone who buys 7 or more at the same time. And Jeremy Hunt bought 7 properties. So this can happen. This 100% can happen. But really, that's not a technical difficulty. That's a problem of corruption. Essentially, that's what it is, the problem of corruption, which is there's this situation where, imagine my channel grows really, 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 really big, and this starts to be like the popular demand. Listen, you need to take action on inequality. You need to take action on tax avoidance, tax evasion. You need to take action on tax of the very rich. These guys they might have to bow to public pressure, right? And they say, okay, we have to bring in a tax on the very rich. Their donors behind the scenes are going to lobby them, and they're going to say, "Oh, but you can't tax this kind of wealth.
Yeah, not oil and gas.
That. We need that, right?" And then they riddle it with loopholes, and they end up avoiding it. Like, this is 100% a risk. 100% a risk. I know it. I know it's a risk. I don't campaign for what I campaign for because I think it's easy to get it. I think in actuality, I think we won't get it. And that's why I campaign what I campaign for, because if we don't get it, what happens is that 1% gets richer and richer and richer and richer, right? Let me ask you a question, right? UK economy is growing at 1%. What rate does a rich person's wealth grow at?
Much faster than 1%.
In the first year of COVID, these guys grew, I think, 22%. Okay. But, 5% is quite modest. These guys probably make 7, 8%. So if these guys' wealth is growing at, say, 5%, let's be conservative, and the UK economy is growing at 1%, where's the fucking wealth coming from? Do you think it's a coincidence that at the same time, we've seen the largest and fastest ever increase in millionaire and billionaire wealth? That stock markets across the world are at an all-time high? That the gold price is at an all-time high? That housing prices are at an all-time high? Do you think it's a coincidence that that massive increase in the wealth of the richest has happened at the exact same time as a collapse in living standards for ordinary people? It's not a fucking coincidence, right? If you don't take action, they will fucking eat you.
Yeah.
They will eat the middle class. If you look at the history beyond the last 70 years, it is a tiny, super rich elite and a vast majority of impoverished masses. And that's not just history. That is what life is like now in Brazil, in South Africa, in India, in Pakistan, all over the world, right? And it can happen here. It can happen here. So if Rachel Reeves was here now, listen, this is a fucking 10-year project. This is a 10-year project. And it's going to be fucking hard. It's going to be fucking hard to get the guys in there who make the taxes to not have them corrupted. Because you have billionaires outside that will pay a lot of fucking money to corrupt those tax makers. A lot of fucking money. But the thing is, if you don't take action now, it doesn't get any easier because those billionaires get richer and richer. What I would like to point out is that we did it before. We did it before. We did it after World War II. And it will not be fucking easy. And I don't expect to fucking win. But if I don't win, then what you see is greater and greater inequality, greater and greater poverty year after year. And you see our grandkids living like fucking Charles Dickens. I'm not fucking joking about that. It can happen here. It can happen here. And if you don't believe me, just look at what's happening now. In this country, here today, half the country struggles to simultaneously feed their kids and heat the home during winter. That will get worse. That will get worse. So if Rachel Reeves was here, I'd say, give me your email. Let's stay in touch because this is a big problem. I'm not targeting. We're not going to fix this tomorrow.
Yeah.
We're not going to fix this tomorrow. This is a fight that we have to fight for a long time.
Gary Stevenson, it's been an absolute pleasure as always having you in the studio. I think that call to arms is possibly the best place we could end it. Trading Game in paperback out on the 30th of January. If you're one of the people that somehow didn't buy it because it was a #1 bestseller, you'll have to get the paperback. Gary, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.